Okay, once more into the realms of syntax for the 10th time. This time we're going to be looking at something called non-modal auxiliaries. So far we've concerned ourselves with modal auxiliaries, which we've argued are of the category inflection and therefore are in complementary distribution with things like tense and the infinitive to. But there are other auxiliary verbs which we make use of in English, specifically have and be, and those are not modal auxiliary verbs. They don't have complementary distribution with tense and infinitives or modals, and therefore they seem to be something different. Now, before we start on the analysis, I'll make you familiar with the actual phenomena that we're going to be analysing. English sentences can come in 4 different forms with respect to these non-modal auxiliaries. If they're not present at all, we have what might be referred to as just the simple form. And these are the kinds of things that we've been looking at so far. The finite ones will contain a tense morpheme, as in John fried the onions, then you've got a past tense morpheme, or a modal auxiliary, as in John could fry the onions. Then there's another form, which we can refer to as the perfect form. Now, it's not really important that we should understand what the meanings of these things are. In fact, the meanings of these forms is actually a very complicated thing. But the syntax is actually fairly straightforward. When you have a perfect form, you get the non-modal auxiliary have inserted into the structure. So we get something like John has or had fried the onions. Note here, we've still got the tense there. This time the tense is on the auxiliary verb, hence the alternation between has in the present and had in the past. The other thing we've got is a morpheme on the main verb, fry. Now this may look, in this particular case, like the past tense morpheme, but it actually isn't the past tense morpheme. The past tense, as we've just said, is on the auxiliary verb, and it doesn't double up and end up on the main verb as well. Instead, what we have is a completely different morpheme, which is associated specifically with this perfect construction. We can see that by the fact that if we use another verb, we get a different form. Okay, if it would be the verb to eat, we would have had the form eaten, not ate. Ate being the passive, the past tense form of the verb, and here we've got the perfect form eaten. Okay, it's just that in some verbs the perfect form and the past tense form are homophonous, and so it's hard to distinguish them. But if we recognize that this morpheme is actually different from the past tense is the thing on the auxiliary verb, and this is another kind of morpheme attached to the main verb. If we recognize that, we can see how it fits the general pattern. Let's move on to look at the progressive, because that has exactly the same pattern. With the progressive, we have an auxiliary verb, this time the auxiliary verb be, and of course the tense is there and that appears on that auxiliary verb, so we alternate between is and was, the present and the past tense of be, and we get an extra morpheme on the main verb, this time it's ing. Okay, so you can see here that the pattern is very similar. In fact, it's exactly the same, apart from the fact that we're using a different auxiliary verb and a different morpheme. But syntactically, they're identical. And exactly the same happens with the passive. Okay, well, ignoring the other aspects of the passive, things that we've already looked at to do with the deletion of the agent and the promotion of the theme to the subject position. If we ignore that aspect of the passive and just concentrate on the other parts, we note we get exactly the same sort of thing as we've got with the perfect and the progressive. We've got our auxiliary verb, this time the verb to be, like the progressive, and that is the thing that has the tense, so we get are or were in this case because the subject is plural. And then we get a morpheme on the main verb. This time it's actually the same morpheme as we get with the perfect. Again, it looks in this case like the past tense, but that's because the verb to fry has this homophonous perfect and past tense morpheme. If we'd have chosen a different verb like to eat, again, we can see that we get the eaten form. Okay, so essentially what we've got then is that with the simple forms, we've just got the tense, either say an ud or an s, and of course that alternates with the modals. But in terms of a bound morpheme, we just get the tense. With the perfect form, in addition to the tense, we have these other two elements. We have the auxiliary have and the perfect morpheme. We'll represent that here as this an morpheme to distinguish it from the past tense morpheme, although obviously it's not always produced as an, sometimes it's produced as ud and other irregular forms. With the progressive, we have the auxiliary verb be and the morpheme ing added to the past tense. And with the passive, we have an auxiliary verb be and this un morpheme added to it. Okay, so these non-modal constructions, sometimes they're referred to as the aspectual constructions. So these aspectual constructions seem to have these two elements added to them, one of them being an auxiliary verb, a non-modal auxiliary verb, either have or be, and the other one being a morpheme which is specific to that construction. Now, I'm going to go through here an analysis of this phenomena, which has its roots way back in the 1950s, in fact, about the middle of the 1950s. And this analysis was really a game changer for syntax. In fact, you can trace the start, the dawn of current modern syntax from this analysis. It was put forward by then a young man called Noam Chomsky, who actually is still the leading figure in theoretical linguistics, even though he's now in his 90s. But he's still very much active and very much at the forefront of current linguistic theories. And most of what we've been covering is sort of can be traced back to work of Chomsky's. Anyway, one of his first analyses was an analysis of this exact phenomena that we've just looked at in English. And it's known as the affix hopping analysis. Now, Chomsky was the first to realize that the complementary distribution between modal auxiliaries and tense morphemes means that they really are the same thing. They occupy the same position. And so back in the 1950s, in the middle of the 1950s, so we're looking at, 65 years ago, he made this analysis where he said that there's a position for the modals, as we see in this sentence here, John may mow the lawn, and that alternates with the tense morpheme. Okay, the ud then goes in the same place as the modal does. Now, ud is an affix. Affix is a bound morpheme. It needs to be bound by something. So he therefore claimed that what goes on here is that there is a process which gets that affix attached to the verb. And the idea is quite simply of affix hopping is that the affix itself hops backwards and sticks itself onto the following element. Given that the following element here is the verb, then we get it on the verb, and we get John mowed the lawn. Now, besides that, then, the next part of the analysis is to claim that these aspectual elements are also inserted into a particular position. Here we've got an example with the perfect. Now, the analysis is that perfect element is a combination of both the auxiliary verb and the affix together, and it gets inserted into the structure as though it was one thing. So the have, the auxiliary, and the n, the morpheme, get inserted into the structure as one thing, following the tense. Okay. Now what that's going to do is insert the have after the tense and a new affix in front of the main verb. Now this new affix, just like the tense morpheme, is a bound morpheme, and therefore it will undergo affix hopping. So what was going to happen here is that the tense is going to hop backwards and stick itself onto the auxiliary verb, and the perfect morpheme is going to hop backwards and stick itself onto the main verb. So what we're going to end up with is John had mown the lawn. Exactly the same can happen with the progressive, where we insert be and ing after the tense as one element, and then by affix hopping, the tense moves back onto the be and the ing moves back onto the main verb, and we get John was mowing the lawn. And the same with the passive. Again, ignoring the other aspects of the passive to do with the arguments and the positions they find themselves in, we insert the auxiliary and the passive morpheme n in as one element following the tense, and then we affix hop the tense and the passive morpheme so that we end up with the lawn was mown. Now, the absolute genius of this analysis is that it's coped with the fact that you can actually combine these aspectual elements. Let's take a look at some more complicated examples. Here's the simple case where we've just got a passive. Okay, so we've got the be and n inserted after the tense, and then after affix hopping, those two affixes move backwards and we get the lawn was mown. Okay, that's what we've just looked at. Now, we can add something else besides the passive. Here we've got an example where we've put the progressive be and ing in. Okay, so now we've actually got three morphemes and two auxiliaries and a main verb. The past tense, the ing morpheme and the n for the passive, and they're all going to hop backwards onto the following element. So the tense is going to go onto the be, the ing is going to go onto the passive be, and the n onto the main verb. And what we're going to end up with is the lawn was being mown. We can do exactly the same thing with the perfect. We add the have plus the n in addition to the passive be plus n, and affix hopping happens to those three affixes, attaching them to the following elements, and we're going to end up with the lawn had been mown. You can even do it with all three. Okay, so here we've got the passive be plus n, the progressive be plus ing, the perfect have plus n, and a past tense. And exactly the same thing is going to happen. All of the affixes hop backwards onto the following element, and we end up with the lawn had been being mown. It's not entirely clear when you would use such a sentence, but if you were going to use such a sentence, this would be how you would form it. Now, since the mid-1950s, things have been developing in linguistics, and the theory has developed in such a way that we're not making the same assumptions that we were. But it's surprising that this original analysis of affix hopping still, to a large extent, is very relevant to today's way of treating it. There have been some changes. For example, one change that's happened over the years is that these days, instead of assuming that it's the affixes which hop backwards onto the following element, we assume that what actually happens is that verbs move forwards. Now, this is for sort of empirical and theoretical reasons, which we won't go into, but we'll just recognize that this is one difference between the current analysis and the old affix hopping one. However, it's a fairly minor difference in terms of how this works, instead of now assuming affixes hop backwards, we just assume that verbs hop forwards. So we can have exactly the same kind of analysis as Chomsky had in 1956. We've got a past tense, we've got the have plus the n, and we've got the mo verb. And what happens is that the have moves forward and attaches to the tense, and the mo moves forwards and attaches to the perfect morpheme, and we end up with John had mown the lawn. Okay, so that's not entirely different from the original analysis, apart from what it is that's actually undergoing the hopping movements. The other big difference, however, is more serious, and that is that in the 1950s, X-bar theory hadn't been invented. In fact, it wasn't until the 1970s, in fact 1970, X-bar theory was even first proposed, and even then it has undergone quite a lot of development in the theory. The kind of things that we're assuming these days, something like this as the core part of a sentence structure, those ideas didn't come about until the mid-1980s. So this is a good 30 years after the affix hopping analysis was proposed. What we assume these days is that the inflection is ahead of the clause. Note, we're still assuming that same thing that Chomsky assumed in 1956, that inflection is the category that tense and modals belong to. And that takes as its complement the verb phrase. Now, obviously, we've developed our notion of the verb phrase somewhat in more recent years, and that is more complicated. But essentially, we've got a verb phrase there, which itself may be a multiple verb phrase with different verbs in it. Some of them abstract and some of them visible. But still, this is the basic structure for the clause. Now, I think you can see from here fairly obviously that there's a bit of a problem here when we want to insert these extra elements. That is, we've got an auxiliary verb that we want to fit into this structure, but the question is, where is it going to go? Now we can see that this auxiliary verb isn't an inflection. It's not in complementary distribution with the past tense. You can get the past tense and the auxiliary at the same time. So this auxiliary verb doesn't go into the inflection position. Clearly it doesn't go into the verb position either. So the question is, where would it go? Well, let me first rule out the most obvious possibility, that it goes into that extra specifier position there inside the verb phrase. There are a whole bunch of reasons why we don't want to assume that. One is because, well, the auxiliary would seem to be just a word, and that specifier position is actually a phrasal position. So we don't want to put words in phrasal positions or phrases in word positions. Words go in word positions. The other reason we don't want to put anything into that position is, well, there's already something there. The specifier of the VP, as we've been arguing just recently, is exactly the place where we find arguments. If the verb is an agentive verb, then it'll be the agent there. If it's a main verb, then it'll be the theme in that position. Okay, so there's always going to be some argument in that position, and again, you can't therefore fill it. Furthermore, it's not just one auxiliary that we've got to fit into this structure, but it's as many as three auxiliaries. So there's the perfect, there's the progressive, and there's the passive. So there's a big question here. How are we going to fit these elements into the X-bar structure that we've assumed? Well, without keeping you in agony for too long, I think probably the most sensible analysis for this is to assume that these aspectual elements are heads themselves. They're heads of phrases, and that phrase is inserted into the structure between the inflection and the verb phrase. Now, there's still an issue here that for the time being I'm going to ignore, and that is well, if this is a head, it's a kind of a strange head because it's made up of two parts. We have the auxiliary part and we have the morpheme part. But for now, let's just carry on with the original analysis, and let's assume that that thing gets added as one thing into the structure. That's a head, and it heads a phrase between the inflection and the verb phrase. Specifically, it acts as the complement of the inflection, and it takes the verb phrase as its complement. Now, the big question that arises there of, well, what category is this element? We've put it down here as X to avoid that issue for the time being, but we're going to have to address the question, what category is this aspectual element? Well, we can approach this from what we already know. We're claiming that this phrase sits in the complement position of the inflection. And inflections, being a functional category, have a very limited set of possibilities as far as their complements are concerned. In fact, functional categories can only take one kind of complement. And we know that the inflection takes a very specific one. By the way, let me just point out here, we're still going to get the same analysis here. That what's going to happen in this structure is that the verb is going to move up to that morpheme associated with the aspect. I've represented it here by M for morpheme, and the auxiliary part is going to move up to the main verb. Okay, so what's the category? Well, we know that inflections only ever take a VP complement. And if that's true, then, well, we've only got one choice for the category of this aspectual element. It's got to be verbal, okay, because it sits in the complement position of the inflection. Inflections only take VP complements. There is actually some empirical evidence that this is exactly how we should treat these aspectual elements. I'll only go through one piece of evidence, but there are several observations that we could make which come to exactly the same conclusion. The evidence that we're going to be looking at is concerns something called VP ellipsis. Ellipsis is where you delete part of a structure in certain circumstances. Here's an example of the kind of deletion that we're talking about. Here we've got two sentences conjoined by the word but. Okay, we've got John will watch TV, but Mary won't watch TV. Okay, now in this situation where you've got two conjoined sentences which have the same verb phrase, you can delete the verb phrase from the second of the conjoined sentences, and what you get is John will watch TV but Mary won't, and you've deleted the watch TV. Obviously that sentence has to mean Mary won't watch TV, it can't mean Mary won't go shopping or something like that, because you can only delete the verb phrase if it's identical with the verb phrase of the first conjunct. Okay. However, there are restrictions on this ellipsis. You can't just delete any part of the structure. So, for example, you can't delete what would be essentially the I bar, including the modal. So you can't say John will watch TV, but Mary. Okay, that doesn't work. Neither can you delete the DP part of the verb phrase. You can't say John will watch TV, but Mary won't watch. Okay, so it seems as though with this ellipsis phenomena, you can only delete verb phrases. Now consider the following. John will have watched TV, but Mary won't have. There we've deleted watch TV, which is a verb phrase, obviously. But there's another possibility. You can actually delete the have watched TV. Okay, so John will have watched TV, but Mary won't. And then what you're deleting then must be a verb phrase. So we come to the conclusion that the aspectual element plus the verb phrase itself forms another verb phrase, which is exactly the analysis that we're proposing here. Okay, so let's now turn to this burning issue of what on earth this double element, this double head is, which involves an auxiliary verb and an inflection. The question I think that we really need to ask here is which one of those two elements is the real head? The obvious way to treat this would be to say one of them is the head and the other is there for some other reason, perhaps a grammatical reason. Now, which one is it? Is it going to be the auxiliary verb, which is the head, and the morpheme is there for some grammatical purpose, or are we going to say that the morpheme is the head and the auxiliary is there for grammatical purposes? Now, we can approach this by looking at a specific set of observations concerning a very special construction. Take the sentence, I watched John burn the house. Now, this kind of construction is very similar in many ways to the kind of causative that we looked at a couple of weeks ago. A verb like watch takes a complement here, in this case, John burned the house. And that thing there looks, to all intents and purposes, from its semantic point of view, as though it's some sort of clause. It's got a predicate, burn, and it's got a complete set of arguments, the agent, the one who's doing the burning, and the theme, the thing that gets burnt. Okay, so it looks as though it's a clause. But just like we saw with the causative verbs like make, the thing that follows them isn't a clause at all because it doesn't have an inflection. And this one doesn't have an inflection either. It's not John burned the house. You can't say I watched John burned the house. And it can't have a modal. You can't say I watched John may burn the house. And it can't have an infinitive. I watched John to burn the house. Okay, so this thing doesn't seem to have any room for an inflectional element. And if it's not, if there's no inflectional element, then it can't be an IP. Often these kinds of constructions, which semantically are clauses but syntactically aren't full IPs and CPs, are referred to as small clauses. This one in particular would be a VP small clause because basically what we seem to have here is just the verb phrase. We've got the verb and its two arguments inside that. Okay, now the thing about this particular construction, which differs from the causative, that's why I'm not using the causative here, is that with a verb like watch, we can have a slightly bigger kind of complement, not just a verb phrase. In fact, we can augment it with precisely these aspectual elements. And when we do, note what you get is I watched John burning the house. There we've got the kind of progressive element, and note what's present is the morpheme. The auxiliary verb is actually absent here. And in fact, you couldn't represent this progressive just by using the auxiliary and not the morpheme. So you couldn't say, I watched John be burn the house. You have to have the morpheme and you can't have the auxiliary verb. Exactly the same is true for passive. I watched the house burned by John. There we've got, besides the other things that happen with the passive, the theme in the subject position, etc., etc. But here we've got the passive morpheme on the verb and no passive auxiliary. And again, you can't just use the passive auxiliary to express this thing. You can't say, I watched the house be burned by John. Okay, so it looks then, to all intents and purposes, that it's the morpheme which is the central part of these aspectual elements, and therefore we could analyze these structures here, these small clause verb phrases, as we see here. Okay, this is, we have a verb phrase lower down. I haven't gone into all the details just because I don't want to complicate things anymore, but obviously burn is one of these transitive verbs with an agent and an agentive verb. But anyway, we've got that verb phrase at the bottom. John is the agent, the main verb is burn, and there's going to be a theme position lower down inside another VP. Above that, then we've got our aspectual verb phrase headed by this ing morpheme. Now what's going to happen here is that, well, just like in other clauses, the subject needs to move up to the top position. But then we've also got our ing morpheme, and according to the current wisdom, the verb is going to move up and support that. So what you end up with is John burning the house, and that's what we end up with here. Okay, so there are some conclusions we can come to from these observations and this analysis. Two, in fact. The first one is that of this sort of strange beast that Chomsky introduced in 1956, this two-part element, it seems as though it's the morpheme that is the important head. That's the thing that carries the meaning. That's the thing that appears when the other one can't. Right? The other conclusion we can come to is about the auxiliary itself, because note, you don't get it in these small clauses. You only get the morpheme in the small clause. You only get the aspectual auxiliary in a full IP. Now that would seem to suggest that it's something to do with the inflection that is causing the appearance of this auxiliary verb. And essentially what we could say is that, well, it's something to do with the fact that the tense inflection needs to be supported by something. So therefore, we can assume that this auxiliary verb is inserted into the structure precisely to support the tense morpheme. It's basically got a grammatical function rather than a semantic one. The semantics is borne by the morpheme itself. That's the main element. Okay, so that's the analysis. Let's have a look at some examples of this and see how it actually works. Okay, here I'm going to use a simple verb phrase involving one of these unaccusative verbs that only has one argument, a theme, and there's no sort of complication to that lower VP. So we've got that right at the bottom. John arrive. Arrive is an unaccusative verb. It has a theme argument. John is the one undergoing the process of arriving. Above that, we've got a perfect n morpheme, adding the perfect aspect to this. Above that, we've got the tense, and then a CP above that. Given that this is a main clause, that CP is going to be empty, so we won't concern ourselves much with that. Okay, so what's going to happen here? First thing that's going to have to happen is we're going to have to fill the subject position, and given that we've only got one argument here, the theme, well, that's the thing that's going to have to move up and become the subject. So John is sitting in the subject position. Now we've got two bound morphemes that need to be supported. The verb can move to support one of them, but because movements are always short, when the verb moves, it moves to the nearest one. And of course, that is the perfect morpheme. So then the verb will move up to that. Obviously, the form isn't arriven, but arrived, because arrive is one of those verbs that has the perfect form, homophonous with the past tense. So it's arrived. Now, if English were Hungarian, what would happen next would be that the verb would then move up and support the tense. And you'd get both the tense and the perfect stuck onto the end of the verb, and you would get something like John arrived. But English isn't like Hungarian. English isn't an agglutinating language. That means that for English, the main verb can just have one inflectional morpheme attached to it. And once it's got that, that's it. It can't do anything else. So once the verb has moved to support this perfect morpheme, it's stuck there. Okay, but we've still got the tense morpheme that needs to be supported. You can't just leave that dangling there. So the only option we've now got then is to insert something else, to make up something that is going to act as the supporter for this tense morpheme. And in this case, we select the auxiliary verb have. Okay, that adds nothing more to the structure other than the grammatical property of being something that can bind that bound morpheme. And we insert it into that structure, and of course it's pronounced as had, and we get John had arrived. Okay, let's look at a slightly more complicated version. This time we've got not just the perfect n, but we've got the ing. Okay, note that there's an order to these elements here. The perfect is the higher one, the ing is after that. If we had the passive as well, that would be lower down still. So there's an order that these elements are put in the hierarchical structure. Perfect is the highest, progressive is the next, and passive is the lowest, and then comes the main verb. Okay, so what's going to happen here? We've got our past tense, we've got our perfect morpheme, and we've got the progressive ing. We've got our verb phrase, John arrive. John is the theme, and arrive the main verb, an accusative verb. Well, again, just like previously, something's going to have to move to the specifier of the IP because that position needs to be filled, and the only thing we've got to do that is John, so that's what's going to move up to there. Then the verb is going to move to support a morpheme. It can only support the nearest one, which is the ing, so the verb is going to move to there, and we're going to get arriving. And now we've got two bound morphemes that need to be supported. They can't be supported by one element because English only allows every morpheme to be attached to one verbal element. Therefore, we're going to need two auxiliaries here, one for the past tense and one for the perfect. Now, we're going to use have here for the past tense because of its association with the perfect morpheme. And we're going to use the be because of its association with the progressive morpheme. Have attaches to the ud and be to the n, and therefore we end up with John had been arriving. Again, when you would actually use such a sentence is unclear, but that would be the form of the sentence if you were to use it. Okay, let's summarize what we've just said. Non-modal elements, i.e. the aspectual elements of perfect, progressive and passive, are verbal. Okay, they are heads heading verb phrases. They're bound morphemes, so they need to be supported. And of course, there's various ways you can support a bound morpheme. Either you can move a verb to it, or you can insert something specifically to bind it. They're placed into the structure in a hierarchical order. The perfect is at the top, the progressive follows it, and then the passive follows that. Obviously, you don't have to have them there, so you can have any of these elements appearing by itself or any combination of these elements. But when all three are there together, perfect is above progressive, which is above passive. The main verb can move to support but only one of these morphemes, and that is going to be the nearest one, precisely because movements are always short. So the main verb isn't going to hop over one of these things to get to a more distant one. It has to move to the nearest one. Any of the morphemes that are left over then, once the verb is supported its morpheme, well then that's exactly where we're going to have to insert our auxiliary verbs. We insert have whenever there's a perfect morpheme there, and we insert be whenever there's a progressive and a passive morpheme. And though they then support the other morphemes that are needed to be supported. Okay, that's the analysis, and I'll see you in class on Monday. Bye-bye.